Hi, in this recording, I'm going to talk about a variety of other aspects of thinking being. I'm going to focus on some of the more physical aspects which are covered in the document, and one of those is, of course, the ability to move and to maintain one's balance, and also the ability to spin and to retain kind of balance and focus. So, one of the notable characteristics of evolved life is its ability to do a variety um, of movements that require a great deal of coordination. In later parts of the document, I'll describe how the brain architecture works with regard to motor function. But at the high level, the design pattern we're going to aim for in this robot design is to have dedicated circuitry in the brain for motor function versus the virtual function. So I'll show later how the vision system works works on that stuff. But for the moment, I'm going to just cover uh, you know well-known examples of say how humans maintain balance, and some good classic examples of what you'd see on TV. Even if it's the Olympics or maybe ice skating or running or jumping or whatever. So basically, a human being has its inner ear balance, um, which we all know if you spin around too much, you lose your balance. Um, so there's sensors in the ear that maintain a sense of balance and will indicate to a person if they're spinning or not. And of course, the classic example is you spin around a point and then you stop and then you sort of fall over because your excuse me your virtual self thinks it's spinning even though your body isn't, and then your body goes into a sort of a state of confusion, and you basically the automatic response of your body is pretty much to bring you down to the ground. There's vision based balance, which is one's ability to see a situation and to know how you're physically positioned, and from that your vision system will tell you where you are in terms of the virtual self versus the physical self. There's the predictive idea, which is um, the rooms in the mind which can take a scene and where you are, and you can predict movements you would make, and then you do them. So you can imagine people who, like, say, do um, dive board movements or whatever, or gymnasts or whatever. They have to physically do the movements, but they also have to do sort of mental visualization of those movements. And then there's what I call the heel toe balance, which is the fact that your foot knows you're on the ground, and it can actually send messages to your brain that you actually are standing up correct. So the idea is that all of these different mechanisms in the body kind of coordinate, and in this section I talk about how certain techniques that are used by people who like spin and whatever can maintain their balance. So in reality, it's a combination of all these different effects, which give us our sense of balance. The inner ear is the older system, because your hearing and so on came before your vision system developed to the level that it did. So that's the older system, and the newer system would be the vision system. So a good example would be dervishes, and they can spin and they can keep spinning around and spinning around and spinning around. And how do they do this without falling over? And if one examines how they do it, they tend to leave. They tip their head over and they stretch out their arm, and they fix their vision system on a point, and they basically keep themselves in on a non-spinning frame of reference, even if they are themselves spinning. So their vision system is given the impression of a fixed point within a spinning frame. So it's almost relativistic, so they can keep going around and around and around. And they have this technique where they move one foot and then they spin and they move another foot, but they keep their vision there. So they're using their vision system to keep themselves from falling over, which is something that potentially an android could use as well if using this idea. Um, so there's different kinds of messages that the body is going to send to the brain. There's the body turning versus the head turning versus the ground turning. So it's not easy for a virtual system to know, is it the body that's turning, is it the head that's turning, or is it the ground that's turning. So one of the key systems is your inner ear balance, and then if one suffers vertigo, it's quite debilitating, where you feel yourself falling in a particular direction, even if you're not physically falling, but your system tells you. Um, Ice skaters and ballerinas use a technique where they fix on a spot, so even if a ballerina, for example, would be spinning quite fast, they tend to keep their head in one place and then they move their head to the next place and they keep it there. So they try really hard not to have their head move. So in other words, they try to minimize the the sense of they try to keep the sensors in the ears as stable as possible. And then there's the heel toe technique where you can keep yourself you if you might have if you're up high and you have vertigo, one of the sometimes what can happen is your virtual self can override your physical self, and you get a sense of dizziness. You position yourself in the wrong location relative to your body in your internal room system, and then you get disorientation. So what you can do is you can do heel toe, where you send messages to your brain to let your virtual self know, I'm right here. It's something that some people suffer from. I add myself to that list, but some people, who like jump off tops of mountains, they don't suffer from this at all. Um, so basically, Android should have some inner ear balance, vision based balance, predictive movements, heel toe, and some kind of balance messaging. So that's pretty much all I want to say on that. A pretty important topic, but these are the high level ideas. There's the placebo effect, which is pretty important and poorly understood. We know it's real because we know if doctors give patients the fake medicines, they often claim they have the effect of the medicine even though they didn't take it. So what gives with this idea? So this idea is actually kind of almost. I see this a little bit like as a proof that some kind of messaging protocols go through the brain, and that is to say, there have been cases where surgeons have faked surgery on an individual, um, uh, and then the individual comes out of the surgery and then has marked recovery because their brain thought they went through the surgery and their body in some way reacted to the surgery and gave a similar response to having had the real surgery. Um, I'm not saying that people shouldn't have surgery. I'm just saying that in a documentary I saw that was the case. So for example, why would it be that if you think you took a particular medication, um, that you could get the same effect without taking it? And the answer is pretty simple, according to this idea. If you have taken a substance and it has given you a chemical response in your brain, then your brain pretty much remembers what the response of the chemical was, or the product was, or the effect was. Your brain. So if one just thinks of a brain as a messaging system, and you know what the input was and you know what the output was, well, if you think you're receiving the input, okay, and that's the key to the placebo effect in this idea, is that if you think you've received the input message, then and then there is some kind of a produced response to that medicine in your brain can retrieve the message stories from your memories related to that medicine and can produce the results, and therefore that is a placebo effect. But the body is actually doing something there. Uh, So that's the way would explain the placebo effect according to um, this theory. Remembered response to a remembered output set of messages in relation to input messages. So that's so if it looks like an aspirin and it tastes like an aspirin, and so on, your brain has already had aspirin. It will have some kind of a recorded response. So that's the idea of the placebo effect. I have a little bit more on it here. Um, so I talk a little bit next about epilepsy and there's a few different types of epilepsy. Some are to do with physical movement and so on. Some aren't. But the basic idea of it is, if one thinks of a message-based architecture, it's basically a region of the brain which is firing too many messages through the system consciousness at the same time, and it jams up the system consciousness. So it could cause kind of physical movements in the motor system, which would be kind of like what you get with people having seizures. Now, just in terms of the balance, I want the Android should have the balance features, but also for the placebo effect, it does kind of make sense for a placebo effect for a machine to know, or an Android to remember the response of an input to an output, which is useful, I think. Epilepsy is just more of a monitoring the Android design, so it doesn't get jammed up with certain messages that are causing trouble. I talked a little bit about this about the chi, where we're balancing the messages. Um, Next, I talk about high functioning autism and nonverbal communication. Um, and this is kind of where it gets kind of interesting in terms of the different message types that the brain processes. And there's a lot of cues that human beings uh, use against each other, and um, so for example, non-verbal cues. So there's the words that we say, and then there's there's all this how things are said. Somebody might say a particular thing and then find that um, people might not like the voice intonation, or they may interpret the voice intonation adding semantic information. There's the body language side of things, language messaging, facial expression messaging. So we have a lot of uh, messaging beyond just the actual sounds that we make. There's the additional information, voice, body, and language. Now, in order for for a typical human being to communicate with another human being, all these things contribute to the overall experience of interacting with somebody. So, for example, you go and you watch videos on training sessions. The people who do the training sessions, they're trained to use certain voice intonations, and they're to use certain kind of positive body language movements and so on, that they get trained to do, and basically it creates a positive experience for the viewer. Now, if you say, like, if I say, for example, talk in a voice that is very deep and very slow, people will infer I'm kind of maybe bored, or it may not create a good impression. To be fair to in some of these recordings, I do sound that way, but um, for whatever reason, when I'm recording it, then maybe I'm a little bit more tired or whatever. But people can pick up on that from the sound of my voice, or whatever. You can hear the non-verbal type, or you can hear the verbal non-verbal gestures. Um, um, so, if in the case of an autistic person, there is brain there is brain mechanisms which are interpreting all that information, whether it's the visual, the facial, or the body language. And this may not seem important in an Android design, but it actually really is very important, because if we see people who are, say, autistic, high functioning autistic people, you see some people and they don't understand body language. A high functioning autistic person may not have any capacity to understand either voice, facial, or body messaging, just not at all. And it can make their lives quite difficult socially to interact with people. And you can often see them, they're confused and they're not sure how to interpret things. So it's real important with the Android design that the Android should, an advanced Android system for intercommunicating with human beings, understands voice, the intonation aspect, the facial expression side, and the body messaging side as well. And body language is itself a big topic. You could buy books on it, and there's all this stuff about how you place your feet facing out, and it's an area of expertise, and people get paid money just to know to understand body language. But we do understand it, but we don't really. It's not written down. It's kind of in the brain architecture. So this is something that this is what these are message types that the Android should have. Um, Another aspect of a human being, it's pretty important, and it's kind of a topical thing, which is the ability of a person to multitask and to take in message cues. And some people, you might say an individual is highly organized, they're able to multitask, or you might hear radio shows where they say men can't multitask, or you get these gender kind of discussions. But the basic idea is that independent of any kind of radio type discussion, we want to come up with an architecture where where an android can multitask. So how do we do that? So we need to design the SC, the system consciousness component, so that it can process as many streams of messages as is possible. I don't lay out the exact architecture here, but in say computer chips, you have this concept of a multitasking queuing system, kind of cores or whatever. But this is more a queuing theory multitasking, as opposed to just a chip with 3 cores or 4 cores. Individually, the message types are themselves actionable. So I think the speed at which they can be processed is important. But you do see high functioning autistic people who have a great deal of trouble if their system consciousness is affected. According to this theory, it can make it very hard for them to do more than say one task at a time, um, depending on how they work. But they do say that people typically tend to focus on one task after another, but highly organized people can do many things at the same time. And this is probably where we kind of enter the role of personality types. One say sort of manager, people who can run many different things at the same time. Next, in the document, I talk about development coordination disorder, or dyspraxia. And this is basically a little bit. We delve a little bit deeper into the brain architecture here, and we talk about coordination of a body and fine motor skills. This is this is kind of more to do with the motor skills side of the body. So we have the physical person and we have the virtual person, and the virtual person and the physical person. The virtual person wants to do a task, and then the physical person sort of has to do it. So um, as is pretty much well understood, the brain has 2 hemispheres, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later about how the 2 hemispheres coordinate with each other, because we're essentially, our architecture is very interesting. Human architecture is, we're two basically coordinating. We have 2 coordinating brain hemispheres. They have to coordinate with each other. There's a degree of dominance in one over the other, but they have to talk to each other. And you can imagine if you have to use 2 hands and 2 legs, and you have to move in a variety of ways. There's a lot of coordination required across the parts of the brain stem that synchronize the messaging. So so in theory, if a robot, an android, has 2 hemispheres, I think it's good that it should be designed that way. We have to really take into account coordination, and it is technically possible that an android could be dyspraxic if the coordination isn't good between the two hemispheres. So this is kind of what I'm kind of getting to. So messages going from one hemisphere to the other to do a variety of motor tasks, and motor tasks are on separate circuits dedicated to hardware, and we want to make sure that they're completely coordinated. And then later I'll talk about the idea of left-handed or right-handed, and basically which hemisphere starts the sequence of steps to do a particular task, like walking or whatever. So that's there. Um, then another thing in the document I mentioned is what I call goal setting, focus, and the self-activating reticular system, which is a bit of a mouthful. But there is this idea in the we have this concept of a subconscious and a conscious, but the idea is that the system consciousness gets a large amount of data from all kinds of subsystems into the body. So, for example, while I'm sitting here, there's a system regulating my breathing. There's a system regulating my heartbeat. There's a system regulating my sleep. There's a system regulating my blood flow, my temperature. All these things going on, and there's messages flying around my body, making sure everything is as it should be. Yet I'm not consciously aware of that, but there's all that information coming into me. So the idea here is that we have message goal filters. So in other words, if I'm awake, the conscious part of me, which is only actually a small part of my overall being, so I am a certain part of my body. It doesn't need to know uh, about temperature regulation unless it gets really cold. You know what I'm saying? So, for example, I don't really care about the temperature in this room if it's within the tolerances of my body. And now, if my body gets too cold, my consciousness will be informed, and will get sort of like a too cold message or whatever you want to call it, and then I maybe have to get properly dressed, attired, or if it's too hot, I have to then maybe get into something a bit more comfortable for the temperature range. So this is where we get into the idea of the goals of a being and how they um, goal setting. And I'll talk about this later in terms of the personality types and how people focus on particular goals. Now, a lot of motivational speakers will talk about your goal centers and how to set your personal goals, and they talk about visualization, and they talk about setting yourself up for success. There's a lot of these self-help books. Now, a lot of these books are really, a lot of these speakers are targeting this self-activating reticular system, but it's basically a kind of filters for all the messaging that goes through your mind in order to say these are the messages which are important to me. I want to I want to go to college, so therefore the focus must be to study hard or whatever. You get the idea. But um, so for example, the example would be if the person's in a house with a young child and a plane flies overhead, they will invariably hear the child crying over the plane because the child is of a higher priority, even though the sound may be of a higher louder to the being. So an Android should adopt these goal-based filters based on the needs of at the time. So this is important stuff, and this is just an introduction to that side of the theory. So beginning to delve deeper into goals, things like the placebo effect, all these things that we kind of know medically, they can mostly all be explained through some kind of a messaging architecture with apps. After this chapter, now that I've completed it, which is chapter 6, but it may not be in the long run. I may change the structure a bit, so I don't really want to call it chapter 6. It's that section to do with the placebo effect and so on. I'll talk next about the olfactory senses and the brain, which is our sense of smell, and we'll start talking about the how we as people evolved and how we developed various sensors for interacting with the world and kind of how they work through this messaging architecture. So that's it for now. I'll leave it there.